Hey guys, working in the greenhouse in the garden, I'm always using 5-gallon buckets. And have you ever had a 5-gallon bucket that two buckets that absolutely refuse to separate from each other? Well, I'm going to show you 14 different ways to separate them fairly easily and 5 ways to prevent it from happening in the first place. So generally the reason these buckets get stuck together is they come together and they slightly pull. It creates a vacuum. And another thing, if you have glue or if you have paint in them, that can be a whole other issue. But generally the most common thing that causes it is that vacuum. Now, one way you can use hot water to separate your buckets is you can change the temperature inside the bucket by pouring really hot water slowly over the base of the bucket where you know that there's an air gap, and that's where the vacuum's taking place. So you just take this, pour it slowly over that area, and over time the inside of the bucket will heat up, the air will heat up, and it will release. Just keep doing that to let that air inside of the bucket heat. And just use anywhere from 1 to 2 gallons to do this. You're going to need really hot water. This came straight from the hot water heater. I took it from inside my basement. And so then you just take it, give it a slight pull, give it a minute for that air temperature to change, then give it a second, and then pull it, and there it goes. It just comes right out. Now, if you're on a job site and you don't have access to hot water, a lot of the people on job sites bring coffee with them, and so you can use a thermos. And if somebody doesn't mind giving you their day's coffee, you could do the same thing. If you really needed the bucket, you just take it, get a little bit of a vacuum going on with this, and we're going to pour that, do the same thing, and just do it very slowly so that the temperature inside the bucket, that air temperature changes. And so although it's wasting a thermos of coffee, if it's the end of the day and they're planning on throwing their coffee away, there you go. Now, another way to do this is to put a few drops of liquid dish soap, and you want to get it right where the buckets are meeting. Put a little bit in there and make sure it gets in there. That's going to cause some lubrication to take place. Go all the way across. You may have to do it on both sides depending on how bad the vacuum is. You take your water hose, spray in there, and some of that will get down inside the bucket and it will break free. So let's try that again. Tilt your bucket up, let some of that soap drain out down into the secondary bucket. Give it a little pull. And sometimes you have to make sure you're pulling on both sides so you're not causing a wedge there. And then that will release the one bucket from the other with a little bit of the soap draining down from the top to the bottom. Different buckets are made in different ways, and these 2 buckets, one's from Lowe's, one's from Home Depot, and they're absolutely stuck together, but they're more likely to get stuck like that if there's just a slight variance. They're almost exactly the same diameter, but sometimes there can be just a millimeter difference, and that can cause a massive sticking problem. So you may want to stick to stacking buckets from the same manufacturer together. And also, one thing to remember is in regards to the dish soap is make sure that you dry out the bucket and make sure it's completely dry when you put them together, because that water in there could cause that vacuum action and it could make it happen every time. So guys, one of the most common methods that's talked about today is using compressed air. And so you just take your bucket, you find where they're put together, try to wedge this in here just a little bit if you can get a little bit of leverage on it, force it in there if you have to, and then give it a lot of air. We're going to do that. We're going to make sure our air is all the way on at full pressure, and then blast it with a good dose of compressed air. And that might release your bucket right away. Now, I know not everybody has access to a compressor, so compressed air in a can that you may be using around the house with your electronics, do the same thing. Just put the tip in there as well as you can and give it a blast of compressed air from a can. So guys, we talked about heating the bucket's air inside by putting hot water on the outside of the bucket. You can also use a hair dryer, or if you have a heat gun around your shop, you can use that. But remember that heat guns are quite a bit hotter than a hair dryer, so you might melt or warp the bucket, so hold it a lot further away. But give it about 30 seconds and then try to pull them apart and see if that air temperature has changed inside the bucket. Now, another thing you can do, if you can wedge 2 screwdrivers, one on each side, and then push them down both at the same time, and you can break that vacuum as well. That may be a little bit harder if there's a very tight seal, but if you can squeeze it in there and pry them both back at the same time, you'll definitely break the vacuum. Now, one thing that's very common that happens when people are struggling to pull them apart, these handles will sometimes wedge underneath, and you think you're giving it all you can, and the handle is actually what's preventing it from coming apart. So just remember, with some different types of buckets, that handle will make you feel like it's truly stuck, but it could just be prevented from opening or pulling apart just from the handles. Now, speaking of the handle, you can use the handles themselves to pry the buckets apart. If they have metal handles, you can take it, put your foot in and step on the handle and then pull the bottom bucket apart, and that will release. But if you're using a bucket that has a plastic handle, there's about a 99% chance it's going to break very easily. Now, I mentioned at the beginning using a quarter, or actually in this case it's going to need to be 2 quarters, but you'll put one on each side, try to wedge it in there, then take your thumbs and push down as hard as you can, and that will break the bucket free. You only need about 1/4 of an inch or less to break that seal or that vacuum. Now, if it's too hard with your thumbs, you can also use a pair of vice grips. Just put your quarter in there, do the same thing, push down, and it will also break it free if it's an extremely tight vacuum. Now, if it's a warm summer day or even just a day where you're getting a lot of intense sunlight, even in the winter months, you can lay the bucket on its side and let the bucket heat up, especially if it's a dark red or dark blue, and the air inside will change temperature. If it's in the shade for a long time and you pull the bucket out, or if you have it in the garage, the air in that bucket is still very cold, so heating that air in there is critical to breaking it free. Now, I demonstrated pouring water on the side of the bucket, but there's just another simple method you can use. You can just pour hot water into the bucket and allow that temperature to change through the bottom. Give it about 5 to 10 minutes for that air temperature to take place, and then try to pull it apart. So another simple method to do this, if the buckets are not dry rotted, remember you don't want to do this with a really old bucket that might collapse with you, but if you turn the buckets on their side and sit on them, the shape of the bucket will deform and make more of an egg shape, and you can pull the top bucket out. So you're going to sit on this area over here, and when it deforms and changes shape, you should be able to pull the bucket out a little bit easier. Now, just a quick note about what I'm doing with all these buckets. I make wicking buckets for my garden, and that really works well. I'll put a video up top to a wicking bucket, and it's really a simple method to grow tomatoes or vine plants like that, or anything you want to grow in the garden, and you can experiment yourself, but I'll link that up above. Now, I was at a friend's house, and he was having his house in the final stages, and there was a painter there, and I've never done this, but I saw the painter do it. He took a 3rd bucket and banged it up against this area right here of the bucket, and by holding this bucket and banging the 1st bucket on the bottom of the 2nd bucket, it actually broke free. In that case, it was really, really much harder because it was a painter who was doing this, but he obviously had a lot of experience on separating stuck buckets. So I use a lot of these buckets in my garden for planting things, and if you're going to plant things in it, then you're going to be drilling holes in the bottom for drainage anyways. So don't worry about unsticking them or pulling them apart. First, drill your holes, and then that will release the vacuum, and you'll easily be able to pull them apart. So talking about drilling holes in the bucket and repurposing them for plants in the garden, I thought of a fun way today, and it's nearing the end of the year, so I stopped by a fireworks stand to see if I could find some fireworks. But even if you drill that hole and you still can't get it unstuck, you drill a 1/4 of an inch hole in the bottom, stick some firecrackers in there, or 1 firecracker, and that explosive force will drive the buckets apart, or it should. But if you have kids around, it will be a fun little thing to show them a way to do something in an alternate way. But of course, you want to be safe with your fireworks as well and have them stand far away. You never know which way the bucket's going to go. So I'm going to show you about 5 or 6 ways that when you're storing the buckets, if you just put them in the back of your basement or something and forget about them, one way that you can keep the buckets from this happening in the first place is to take an old garden hose, cut it into about 12 to 18 inches of each, stick it in the side, and just kind of wedge it in there, and it creates a gap there where you'll never have this problem. And you don't have to use probably this length, maybe 6 inches would work. Just remember, you're trying to prevent that vacuum from happening, and you're creating a gap where it can easily be pulled apart. Now, if you're storing your buckets in a dry area and you don't want to use an old garden hose, or you don't have one, you can use something as simple as a piece of cardboard, maybe 6 inches long, 3 inches across. Just fold it in half, pull them apart, and then put that in there, and it'll wedge and keep a little bit of an air gap that will prevent it from happening. But remember, you don't want to do this part if you're storing your buckets outside. This will disintegrate and possibly fall into your buckets, and then they will maybe go into that vacuum state again. So I was doing a little remodeling a while back, and I had some leftover wood shims, and also that can be used if you are storing these outside where they can possibly get wet. You don't want to use cardboard. You can use a wood shim. It's very thin at the base, at the top is thicker. You can put one in there and just let it slide down, and then that will stop before it reaches the bottom. Just enough room to pick it back up and pull your wood shim out when you go to use your bucket again. So just remember, something as simple as a wood shim will prevent that from happening. You can put it up here, but I think the best way to do it a little tricky with these handles. But I think the best way to do it is just allow the bucket to slide all the way down, and then you have a gap there that prevents that air from turning into a vacuum. Now, I know very few people probably have some old wood shims that have been laying around unused, and I have just happened to have those in a drawer, and I thought about it. But what I really want to talk to you about using is something as simple as a clothespin. Take it apart. They're super simple to come apart. Do the same method. Put it in and like that. It will wedge. As you can see, it's wedged right there, and that will also prevent that vacuum from happening. Now, another way you can prevent the buckets from sticking together is using something as simple as a zip tie. You're going to drill a hole right at the base right here, not too close, but just right about there where you can put the zip tie through. I'll do that real quick. You're going to take your zip tie, run it through there. Maybe a little tricky in getting it in there. All right. Probably need to do it from this side. Let's see now. Okay, we're going to take our zip tie, run it through, and run it to the top. And this way you don't have to worry about leaving something in it all the time. And just push it down. And that way it will eventually settle a little bit where it's more straight up and down. But that way when you put them together, that zip tie will create just a little bit of gap there that will prevent the buckets from coming all the way together. And that way when you go to take them apart, they come apart a lot easier, and you don't have to worry about keeping track of wood shims or clothespins. So if you don't have any zip ties handy, you can use something as simple as a piece of cord. Drill the hole, do the same thing, tie it at the top, let it droop down into the lower bucket, and it does the same thing. It'll probably last even longer if you have the right type of cord. Now, if you don't have the zip ties, the shims, the clothespins, or any of those other things, you can use the bucket itself to cause that wedge. Just take the top bucket, take the top of the handle and shove it into the lower bucket, push it down, and that will prevent it from going any further. So that air gap is there. You'll never have a problem. So that's one thing you can do. You don't have to do anything. That is such a simple way to do it. Anybody could just do that, store your buckets, forget about it, and then when it comes time to take them apart, just give them a good yank, and they come right back apart. So guys, there was a couple of other ways I'd failed to add to our 14 before we went to the way to prevent it from happening. But another thing is using something like a torch, not too close, but doing the same thing and heating it up. It all depends on what you have in your basement or around your shop. WD-40 will work, or something. If you're using this for planting vegetables, use something like vegetable oil spray. Spray it down in the crack, and that will also work. So just remember, there's a lot of different ways to get them apart. But my favorite is just the tried and true method of the air hose and blasting a little bit of air in there. So guys, if you're watching this video, more than likely you have two buckets that are stuck together, and one of these methods will hopefully help you get it apart. And one of the 5 or 6 methods of keeping it from happening again will work for you as well. So if you found something helpful, if you liked the video, I hope you'll like and subscribe, and have a great day.